Thanks for joining. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Turrbal and Yagara people, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd like to introduce our wonderful speaker, Dr. Cathy Robinson, who's with us today from CSIRO. She leads a research group there. She's an adjunct professor at UQ, and she's the chair of the IUCN Green List as well. So through her long-standing work with the Digital Women's Ranger program and a range of other collaborative initiatives, Cathy's interested in exploring how data can support genuine cross-cultural collaborative conservation with Indigenous and other local communities. So I'd like to introduce Cathy and welcome her today.
Well, hello to everyone here and online, Stu. So I hope this is a safe space, because I'm conscious that what I'm about to talk about is quite a disruptive moment. I think that's getting bigger and bigger in conservation science and practice. Big data, AI models, fabulous, are really now plotting brilliantly the demise of our planet. And, here is the world leading centre of doing that. At the same time, we've got to ask ourselves about the data practices and data insights, and what does that look like for where all those biodiversity hotspots are. And as my last talk here showed, we've started to really realise that we can't get this done without involving and engaging Indigenous and local communities. So I get really excited by that intersection between how do we start to work through what the insights of big data and all that stuff can do, and partner with some fantastic researchers to do that. But I really care about that kind of, how do we work that data harder for local communities? How do we work that so that that data actually starts to not only provide insights on engagement, but actually benefit and rights? And so that's where I'm framed. But I really want to highlight, this is a bit of a safe space I'd like to open up. So you might have some really questions you don't feel like you can ask. I think we should open this up today, because this is the spirit of learning, to be able to ask it. And I say that because sometimes you might say, oh, I can't ask that because it might be a bit more awkward. Please go for it. On the note of awkwardness though, I really do feel a bit uncomfortable standing here, noting that there's a lot of people involved in the Digital Women Research and Ranger program. So can I please just be noted that I'm just literally the kind of coordinator of it, but I really want to acknowledge we have some fantastic postdoctoral researchers, we have some spectacular software engineers, we have some unbelievable AI modelers, we have some extraordinary Indigenous women rangers, and we have some incredible coordinators, and this is a village. So I just want to please place myself there, because this is certainly not my work. Yep. So on that note, let's go for it, hey? Okay, so here's our dilemma. We have some things going on in Australia and globally where we're starting to say, how do we repair nature? And so then that sets us off into a flurry of data and modelling and insights that come from those big data systems. It's pretty grim globally and nationally. We're starting to chug those demise of species and places, and I've written with a few of these fabulous people in this centre on some of the global insights where we first mapped the intersection between Indigenous lands and biodiversity hotspots and mammals and all sorts of things. And part of that's to say, okay, this big data gives us these big pictures that we can't do with just local and Indigenous knowledge. So, that's point one. And some of the markets and our, funders and our programs are demanding now a more, rigorous assessment of what's going on the state of things. So we need to know baselines, we need to know where we're going, we need to know scenarios. And so that evidence is growing in a pretty exciting way. Same time though, we have this kind of parallel debate going on. And that's partly this thing around Indigenous data sovereignty, around Indigenous rights, and how do we start to think through that at the same time we're doing all these global models and insights. That's really starting to say, okay, we've learned a bit from that conservation era in the 60s and 70s where some of that rub between conservation agendas and Indigenous agendas was pretty tense in terms of, how do we balance that Indigenous rights versus conservation agenda together. The same debates are now happening again with data. Because at the end of the day, this nature conversation is a data conversation. I mean, there's a few things out there that are furry and lovely, but actually where it's all hitting the road is this question around what data, who owns it, who can give the insights, and who tells that story. So I get really excited by this intersection. I've just given 2 examples in Australia, which is the nature repair market, which some of you might be slightly excited about, and then of course the governance arrangement around that. There's actually a 3rd document that I was tempted to do, which is the digital economy of Australia, which has 1 line in it. I'm going to say it again because it's 1 line. Not that I'll never comment on that, but I think it's interesting that it says, well, what's the digital economy for Indigenous Australia? And it talks about inclusion. It doesn't talk about an economy, it talks about an inclusion question. So if you want to go to the most challenging area of digital inclusion in Australia, you would go to remote Australia, you would go to remote Indigenous women, and that's where you would find the lowest of the low according to that index. And that's where our digital women range program starts. If you went to the highest biodiversity hotspots in Australia, you went to the most significant species and places, it is exactly the same place where those women are stewards of that country. And that's where our digital women range program. And so here's one looking over her country, and it's changing. It's changing so quickly. It's changing rapidly from climate change, weeds, feral animals. She's trying to work that through in her own system with a whole bunch of disruptions. And so we got asked, how do we bring data into our own stewardship systems and governance systems and show, not from just on the ground, but it's exactly the same image here from a drone. How do I start to get insights from this space? And this has been a long endeavour of mine because I get kind of excited by a whole bunch of questions here. How do we make that work together? They're quite different learning systems. They're quite different epistemologies. They're quite different power dynamics. And that's half the fun. Okay, spoiler alert, all this is in a paper that we just did a review of this because we're kind of curious. This was like, onboarding postdocs as well as part of that journey, but we're kind of curious around, well, what's going around globally around this? And I think it's quite interesting to start to think through when you start to trawl through all the papers and examples, which we all did. We just start to think about, well, how do we do this justice dimension here in this digital space? What does it look like? Where are the rubs? Where can we learn from and where do we need to improve? And that's kind of the, I guess, theoretical and methodological framing of this paper and this talk that I just wanted to kind of unpack and open up a conversation with. So in that then you can see we've kind of got this fan which we use now as our template for all the work we do, which begins unsurprisingly as, well, planning. So who gets to tell the story? Who gets to choose the species or the place or the questions that we have to ask? And how do we actually share that with Indigenous groups? When sometimes that's got scale, temporal and spatial challenges. Sometimes it's got knowledge, co-production challenges and rubs. So there's a piece there that planning tends to be not bad, but often on the conservation science and conservation agendas point of view. Data collection, there are so many exciting programs now that engage Indigenous people on how to set a camera trap. Awesome. The trouble is, of course, is they're setting up a camera trap to find out something that the conservation science wants to know. And so there's a kind of piece there, isn't there, that it's really great first step, or drones, or you name it, or digital mapping, all the things that you can do now. But there's been a really critical step and exciting area where we're bringing Indigenous groups into our digital tools, but usually on our terms. And so that's, please help me map the ... species, or can you help me set up the camera traps? And I'll pay you to look for whatever. I'm not critiquing it. I'm just saying that that's what's happening, and it's an exciting happening. And what's happening then as a result is Indigenous groups themselves are going, hang on, we can take on this technology. We can start doing it for ourselves. We can start asking our own questions. And so there's been a really exciting movement here of going from more top-down approaches to that to a collaborative space to actually Indigenous owned space, which I think is pretty exciting. Now we get to the furry bit. The data management, data analysis and processing is usually when we grab those SIM cards out of those acoustic recorders or wherever, take it back into the machine and then spin the AI models around them or whatever. And so this is where it gets really tricky because that's when it definitely goes out into the spaces of how do we train our models? What are some of the assumptions we make? What are some of the care or fair principles we use in terms of data we use? Where does that data get sucked up into the cloud? There's some really challenging questions for conservation scientists here. I'm not saying they're easy, but how we train our models and how we start to share that, it can actually be a real contradiction in terms of some of that ways in which we can do those place-based collaborations. I told you this was going to be a bit contentious, but I thought, we just have to stay awake. Data translation, so who tells the story? Who gets the win? Who gets the benefit from that? And I guess for me, I'm really conscious that I'm working in very remote, resource poor communities, and I'm on a professor salary. And I get to have all the ways in which I've got, fabulous data and infrastructure. And so there's a question there about who gets to tell the story, because we know actually from an economy point of view, this is where the money is, right? This is where the resources get. This fabulous centre, the CSIRO, is where it really gets interesting. So how do we move the dial here so that we can actually get some jobs on country that are about data jobs? And again, that's back to the Digital Women Ranger program. So that's the spoiler alert of what I'm going to talk about. And I'm happy to go back through this because I know it's really challenging. But I want to tell you what we did with the fan. Okay, so all this is on the website. If you type in Digital Women Ranger program, you can see all this. So I just wanted to step you through what we did in terms of that challenge. So part of this is about trying to find these culturally safe and innovative ways to collect, use and share monitoring data so Indigenous women rangers can make decisions to care for country. So each step of that fan. Our one-liner is, how do we empower Indigenous women to tell stories about country using data? That one sentence has so many dimensions to it. It has innovative dimensions where we've got to get that data to work harder in resource poor, crappy Skylink environments. It's got to work where we've got very poor infrastructure to do that. We're doing it with the lowest of the low in the digital index, right? So that's literacy, everything around it makes it hard. So not only do we have to be innovative, culturally innovative, we have to be technically innovative. And it's so much fun. And that's our report, which talks about how we started. We've spent a year co-designing this process out on country. And this is we've just gone into Central Australia and a bit further east, but this is I've just got back from holidays, but I guess part of this was, this is the key groups that have been involved in that, just so you get a sense of where we are. But key was that setting up the principles under which we would do this process. They're not, there's no surprises there, but it's actually quite difficult to run a program on these principles. So if it's Indigenous-led and self-determined, it means that we have to have a governance committee, our Digital Boss Lady committee. So any participating group elects 2 women who guide every step of the way. Money story, the project story, the resource story, the review of those projects, expressions of interest of groups who want to put in for these programs, and the support that they'll get. And so that was really important. And then on the ground, we have to have locally Indigenous governance arrangements so that those local stories that we're going to be telling or exploring are governed at the local level. Community specific, that's either readiness, so some are at like day 1 of this journey, never seen a camera trap, never seen a drone. And so we start to resource what's called a data plan. So we actually just start to say, what story do you want to tell? And let's just start to think through. Others are just like digital boss ladies, for sure. And they're doing some pretty sophisticated work now. For example, monitoring feral animal impacts on water holes at Watercan, using a whole range of digital tech to do so. Deep listening and two-way learning just means that it's kind of literally two-way. We don't call this training or research or anything. It literally is us all having a crack at learning together, because there certainly had to be some changes we've all had to make this work. Impact care. So we have a whole program logic that was designed by those Indigenous women about what does success look like. It's probably not what I would have chosen necessarily. And it's been quite interesting to start then thinking about what does that mean. And I'm happy to talk about this later. And sharing and building new knowledge. Very inclusive program. So Indigenous researchers and women rangers are part of this crew, as well as our coordinator, and men. Now, I have to say this is really important because our men we could not do without. They're often the elders of that country. They are key mentors and they are key enablers. And so we have a very specific role for men as part of that. And we're pretty fluid, it's a self-identified position at Indigenous Digital Women Ranger. And so, you can get to wear a pink t-shirt if you're a Digital Women Ranger, or a blue t-shirt if you want to be a mentor. Okay, so I just want to give you a few examples of what we've been up to for the techs in the room. Just trying to think through then, how do we actually design these things? And I'll just give you a couple of examples of how we've done that from a modelling or a digital platform sort of point of view. The first one on the left was really starting to think about how do we work AI systems into Indigenous knowledge systems? And how do we think about that in terms of data governance and knowledge sharing protocols? How do we think about that so that the AI can do some assessments, the Indigenous knowledge can do some assessments? How do we design a platform so that can be revealed in terms of something that's really usable out on the field? And how do we keep reviewing and adapting it? Key to that was actually starting to bust open some of the AI logics of where that AI was learned. And so you can put gates into AI models and that sharing. So the first that only elders get to see it, and then they open the gate, and then the community gets to see it. Then you open the gate, and then the last but not least is what the public can see. So what you're seeing here is a public version of this that's up on the Nest something website. And so part of this was, again, what indicators do we want to do to indicate this health of this beautiful gorgeous wetland? And so they chose those indicators, and what tools do we then need, digital tools that we need to do that, to monitor the change of country. And how do we then use technical knowledge as well as Indigenous knowledge to do that? In the AI system, for example, it's pretty hot. This is in Kakadu at Nardek. It gets very, very hot out there. So the drone is a really good way of efficiently assessing that wetlands and where we're spraying weeds. We had to design that though, and so a key indicator species to do that was included magpie geese. The way in which we got that information was designed so that it fitted with a Indigenous seasonal calendar, so they could make sense of that data based on their seasonal calendar, which makes sense, right? But most importantly, when the drone could do that, we could get that back in the ranger station on time, so we could actually make a decision with it. So it had to be kind of fairly rapid. So, you know, again, it was not necessarily nature paper robust. It had to be practically robust to get us through in that space. I've got a few papers at the end here, so you can have a little bit more about that. But that was a really good way of us thinking through the areas which we chose were those of high value rather than just conservation value. So it ended up being bush tucker sites were really important. And that's where we concentrated our efforts. So those adjustments were really good learning curves for us about how do we adjust the way in which we do conservation science. Couldn't resist this for the few friends who are possibly online who are bird nerds. So at the moment we're playing around now with acoustic recorders and starting to think about how do we train that, because if anyone's used any of the acoustic stuff from BirdNet or others, it's all trained on Northern Hemisphere birds. So we're training them now on Northern Australian birds. But most importantly, we're choosing the species that they indicate healthy country for Indigenous groups. So, for example, and also we've designed this with them so that it can work with someone who might not be very literate in terms of words or spaces or design. And it didn't quite work, I tried it this morning. But you can hear that bird, so there's a plumed whistling duck here. So this is at a billabong. This is a species that's really good tucker as well, so it's a good indicator species. You can hear that bird, but you can also see the signal. So there's the reference sound, so anyone who's played with this stuff looks like. And then of course this is part of the process. And what's important here is purely on a technical level, this is quite an easy exercise, except beautifully designed. But what's been really lovely about that is actually everyone's listening to all the other sounds around that sound. They're quite excited about the verification process. Now see where I'm getting to in that middle of the fan here. They're starting to work through the data management process as well as building digital skills and literacy skills to do that. And what's been exciting is to say, well, this is what the model reckons. And so we do the high confidence results from what the model thinks. And then let's verify it and prove the model. And so we're having a dialogue with that model now as part of that verification. And we're just about to send out another whole pile of acoustic recorders next year because people are pretty excited about hearing country as much as seeing country from the sky, from say drones, or seeing it through camera traps while we're away. So what does this look like in practice? Well, we choose an area that the ladies want to go for, and in this case it was a billabong where it's a really important foodscape as part of that process. They get trained on how to set up that acoustic recorder with a technical specialist who's very good at acoustic, thank you Nina. They actually then get involved in that data processing, and around the table is pictures of birds, it's language names, we're putting bilingual names around our camera trap species. The elders get involved as part of teaching them that knowledge. And we're starting to think about, well, does that tell us about healthy country or not? Now, it's only value adding to, it's not going to give you that global data set. It's definitely a community monitoring program. But we're starting to think through, okay, we've got all that global data around this system, that's fine. What can we add to that? And what can we value add to that makes sense to us? And of course, couldn't help it, but we, part of that is we celebrate that, and that was our award for Territory NRM collaboration we got last year. But again, the ladies all got up and talked about that process in their own way of just sharing that story with other digital women rangers to build their confidence to do so. We've also put and designed very ranger-friendly guidelines to do this. I know this is really practical and perhaps not as new. It's fantastic. These take forever, but part of this, and they're all free on the website. So if you just literally write Digital Women Ranger or Healthy Country, key to that has been just to walk through that step with a guideline on how to set a camera trap, how to fly a drone, how to do digital mapping, with a ranger's eyes. And it's been fantastic just to step through that process with lots of photos of women, which inspires a whole range of women. We get so many queries around. It's so lovely to see that practically done, including your shopping list for camera trap that you may or may not get from Bunnings, so that you can just go through literally as part of that process. But the actual act of co-authoring that has been really good at solidifying some of those skill sets in doing that. We partnered with Charles Darwin Uni, which has a Cert 3 conservation space and or TAFE processes, and we've created what's called a digital badge. It's like a little sort of formalising an informal learning so that you can do that in the day in the life of a ranger. It gets pipelined into CDU. Once it's been verified by a technical authority, so someone who's, say, a drone CASA licensed operator, as well as a cultural authority, because those digital badges include steps that are not only about flying it up and down the air, but also that the consent, the data care, the data protocols have been followed. So they've been a really nice way of stepping through both those steps. 2 people have to sign that off, and then that gets put as a prior learning. And I think last count we had about 182 digital badges have been completed, so we're very happy. But we keep adding to them, and so we're just finishing off the acoustic recorder at the moment. But this gives this process of, going through those steps. You can do those badges as many times as you want. We don't really mind. But what's also nice is that the coordinator who turns up gets that list of people who've already done that prior learning, and so we can build. Look, I just wanted to kind of finish off because I think the conversation is a bit more important than me sitting here yakking away. Perhaps just to say, was this science or what's the kind of science area that this is contributing to? And I just gave a few of our recent papers in case this is of interest. What's been nice about this, and I've kind of put them in 2 blobs. Part of this is just starting to ask these questions at the moment. So it's this intersection between conservation, AI and data and Indigenous, right? That's where we're playing kind of theoretically, methodologically. It's been really nice to then ask some questions around AI and what is it not doing and what is it doing from global data sets. It's been really nice to think about, okay, how do we evaluate what that research impact is? And so we're getting Indigenous people across the whole program to monitor and evaluate us every step of the way. And that's been really insightful in terms of that program model, what success looks like and what those activities are and the impact looks like from your partner's point of view. It takes a lot of resources and it takes a lot of effort, but it really does provide some insights about how to do this in practice. And again, start asking some questions here around whether it's nature evaluations and how they're created from these institutions like Nature Repair, but also the data infrastructures that we create around those. We're starting to just dig into and going, how do we improve that middle bit of that fan? How do we start to make those models to be trained better? Or those glitches in the infrastructure that people can do, which Jen's paper was out. And so Jen's it came out literally this morning. But how do women working in these little glitches? We're not trying to do an overtake of your entire worlds, but is there mechanisms here that we can actually work with here where collaborative can at least start? We know this is a journey towards data justice and good conservation. This is not this is literally a long journey. We're in it for the long haul. We're not pretending that we're there yet, but I think these first steps are really important. Part of what I get really excited about this program, I think, is that this co-production of knowledge is just in our DNA. In other words, we're all there to learn. And so we really take care on how that knowledge can be woven together or not, or where you can get big insights or not, or where that community-based monitoring can value add to a top-down model or not. And so I think that's some kind of interesting research questions that we perhaps need to ask more and more as we start to not just monitor the death of our planet and all the species in it, but actually find some ground-up solutions that use some of that data with locally based evidence to give that a go. I'll go back to the stand in case any sites and to ask any gnarly questions.
When you talk about co-management and the community's needs what are the community's needs in terms of that? What are they optimizing? What is their subsistence based on? What is the, those stockholders, what is the stock that they care about in this story?
I'll answer two parts of that question because you actually asked two bits that are interesting. So what is co-management? So there's an interesting thing in Australia where tenure matters a lot. And so that's a little different in overseas. And so in some areas of Australia, you have Indigenous owned land, that whether that's been granted under land rights or a native title or a land use agreement. And so that's the basis upon which conservation agreements then begin. Some of those groups have set up what's called an Indigenous protected area as part of that, which is basically an expression of saying, I'm really keen to use parts of my land use under a IPA framing. And that gives them, they write a plan, it's called a healthy country plan often, or a Indigenous protected area plan, and that articulates what they want. They spend quite a long time, a lot of energy deciding on that, and they pretty much set out the goals and their concerns and the threats around that. That gives you a really good guidance about what that looks like at the end of the day. And what I really am struck by, if you look at any of those plans, so that's one way. The other way you can do co-management though is like, for example, in Queensland and in other areas, it might be an agreement between a government agency and an Indigenous group. So that's a different form of co-management, and sometimes the rights around that aren't as strong for Indigenous people as it would be for an Indigenous land. The third part of that is actually if you've got, say, an agricultural landholder who really wants to do cultural burning on their land, for example, that would be almost a service agreement that would happen. And so that's a different, it's more kind of a collaboration rather than a co-management arrangement. But see how there's like a typology almost, or a spectrum of that process. And so that framing of governance around this really, really matters. So how do we know what they want? Well, part of that is that they're often expressed in those plans, right? The second part of that process, though, is that we go in with their board. So they usually have a board, always have a board to guide that. And whether that board is from an Indigenous organisation or the IPA, we sit down with them and say, righto, what do we want? What do we want to do together? And so those steps then begin. And they'll often be referenced by those plans. But they'll also often be referenced by things like we want jobs on country. So, for example, we employ Indigenous mentors out in Arnhem Land whose whole role is they've got this skill set to a point now. Their role is to be paid for is to teach other women how to do that, which is just fabulous. And so they're out there teaching other groups there, and they get paid to do that process. And that was one thing they wanted, is they wanted jobs on country using those digital skills. Does that help?
Yes, but what I meant was, what is it that they typically want? I mean, you said we asked them what they want, but what I'm asking is just to get an intuition, what kinds of things?
What some of the projects?
I'm not from here. I know.
Well,
I have no idea. What's their subsistence based on?
This
farmers,
is not a
do they raise
question.
cattle? Do they hunt? Do they work in the town and they want it just to go hiking in weekends? What's the set? Well, I mean, I'm lacking the background. That's why.
Okay. What they want is not necessarily linked to what they eat. So just
as examples of economic.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. So I'll give you some examples of some great projects that some of our postdocs are doing. So Hayley is leading one around bilbies in Tanami with the local women rangers around there. And that's really using the impacts of like how drones can actually spot burrows from the sky pretty efficiently, actually. But the women get very involved in looking at the tracks on the ground and knowing whether they are bilbies or not. So we're dancing between how do you use drones and tracks together so that it can be both efficient and effective at a local ground. Now, those groups who live there are very, very remote. They would live in an outstation and they would use both bush tucker and food from the shop to eat, if that's your question. Yeah. But it's not necessarily linked to what they want to do with digital, right? They're not just using it to eat. They're using it to gain knowledge. They're using it to look out on country. Another example would be Kara's work out at Waterton. Kara's extraordinary. She's so our postdocs we've embedded them with some of those Indigenous groups so that they can work part-time as an ecologist and part-time as a postdoc. Kara's one of those, and she's just fabulous. And so we've been looking at all the water holes that they really care about and monitoring feral animal impacts before and after management actions. Now, those feral animals are things like pigs and buffaloes and things, but they're also, some of those are sources of food. And so we've got to think about values, both not only of those water holes, but the values of those species in that interaction. So we're using a whole bunch of digital tools with those ladies to set up, to look at changes of those water holes based on indicators they want to look at, to be able to guide what those management actions are for them. Now they're balancing those decisions not just on the health of that water hole, of course, they're balancing it on, can we get some, nature repair market money, or can we get some safari money, or can we get some, and this is not just Wanaka, but other groups are starting to make those kind of decisions about, well, if I kill off these animals, do I lose out at something else? So every decision they make, but now we're getting into conservation decision science. There's some questions around opportunity cost as much as gain from the environment. So each group is so different in terms of their livelihood, if you're in your language, I suppose. But also it's not the same as the questions that we're asking is not necessarily linked to their livelihood needs. Yeah. I hope that answers that question.
I'm curious how the conversations start, like how you bypass the stereotype of non-Indigenous. Like who initiates the conversations? Community know that this program exists and then they realize they want to apply it to a certain area of their country, or how is it initiated?
Much. So it began actually at the end of the last nest, juggernaut we all got involved in. And so part of that was when we finished that one at NARDO, which was really a research project, which was how do we get healthy country indicators to start to inform Kakadu National Park stuff. And that's when we brought in, technology as part of that piece. When we finished, we kind of said, what do you want us to do next? I said, we want it in our hands. We want to start to work with that. And so that's where it began, to be honest. And so we then ran a workshop that just said, anyone who wants to come, let's just have a chat about it. Mm-hmm. And so then we got a group talking it through. It's in the report on the website if you want to step it through. We then went out into West Arnhem for a week and we brought everyone who was keen to be part of that conversation to just sit down and map what that looked like. And so it's pretty open, it's an open space. To be involved though, just part of that is we've set up so the Digital Boss Lady Governance Committee set that up. Expressions of interest then can come through a group who might want to be involved. And then that Digital Boss Lady Governance Committee makes some choices about what to do. Our challenge is we just don't have enough staff to look after it all. So we're not really keen, we're not as into that kind of, I won't say shallow, we don't tend to just do a one-off thing. It is a long, because we go through each step and we do some research projects around that, right? This backs onto some research or some programs that are already there. On the ground though, what we do in the coordinators, look, if you've got a program, say, looking for, I don't know, whatever it's called, dugong, for example, there's already a dugong project already underway. What we tend to do is go, well, can we value add to it? Can we add an extra piece to that? So there's already a building project going on in Central Australia, right? But they want to just add this extra piece on it going, can we just, look at this difference between drones and tech as part of that piece and train the women rangers to be part of that process. So we can negotiate to do that value add. So it's a pretty fluid and open. But, we run workshops and so Territory Area, next Territory Area, if anyone's up in Darwin in November, we're just going to be running some of the highlights from that program and hang out for the rest of the week where we'll definitely get ranger groups from all over the place just to say, how can we get involved? And so we can then give them a whole bunch of entry points. Thank you.
Great talk. Thank you for having this. I have a question, I guess, kind of based around the PhD student's perspective. Oftentimes, if we're doing field work, it's maybe directed by our advisor, may not necessarily have connections with the landscapes where we're working, and potentially those landscapes could cover lots of different Indigenous groups. I've got experience working in the wet tropics, working with, in some national parks, great Indigenous group engagement. In other national parks, they're spread too thin, right? They've got sea country and terrestrial biologists. They're not that interested in what I've got going on. Well, do you have any recommendations for ways to not necessarily fill in the gaps, but kind of engage meaningfully with groups that are spread too thin, don't necessarily have, I wouldn't say interest at the time to engage meaningfully in a project that, is on a short deadline, funding schedules, that sort of thing.
Yeah, two things perhaps from this point of view. So we literally set this whole program up as a day in the life of a ranger. So you can start day zero. So some of these badges are literally, these ones here that we've talked through here, sorry, this one stuff here, There's an introductory one, which is literally like it's just the first start of just learning how to set it up. That's all you do, right? And we just do that a few times. It's like, so that early engagement is, some groups are just really happy just staying at that introductory phase and know what we're doing. We then have a conversation going, well, we're going to go now and set up a whole bunch of acoustic recorders. And we've done that consent process. So that's where they stop, and then when we take over. Yeah. Other things, but that process of even just engaging them with that first step then says, oh, next time can we come and do that next? Yeah. So I guess my answer would be, even those who've got really low, so some of our groups don't have many, particularly women rangers, as part of that. It's, you know, it's often quite hard. And so we just allow you just gently just ease in. Others don't even have the capacity to do it. So we've been running workshops, digital women range workshops every year for the last 10 years, where anyone who comes can come in and just learn what's going on. And so we just set it up so that we can just walk through this process of going, right, this is what we've done. And some of the ladies have been doing that pretty well, give a little talk about what they've been up to. We have videos and, you know, all that stuff, just so it makes it a bit not scary to give a talk. And part of that then just gives it a really safe space to go, how do I set up a camera track? Right. And so then we just set up, you know, that's the back corner. It's just, and why would I use it? And what's some of the questions we ask? So we do set up that second process as well. So that's not involved in the program per se, but we've engaged, I think last count was about 2,000 people in various workshops who can just come and go into that space. But your third question is a really, like the third part of that question I think is really important. How do we do this when we've got funding, research objectives, got to crack an H paper or something like that? Like they're not, this is harder, isn't it? Like to get those sort of metrics up. And I guess that's probably what does drive me to sometimes write to some of those journals. Because I remember at the start of this journey, Hugh jokes and said, oh, you know, but you'll never crack, you know, his favourite list. What's that? Which is one of them. And so for me, there's a process there because we need to have that debate. We need to have those conversations. And I think it's just we write differently. We write different questions. We write different analytics. So perhaps the ones that are there at the moment. And I think that needs to happen. Social license to operate for conservation science is getting trickier and trickier, as we know too. And I say that bluntly because, you know, it's not like we can go in there and we'll just stay in our offices and look at secondary data. It's only going to tell you so much. So if we're going to start to get new insights from the data, maths will only get you so far. And so I think when we're starting to ask better questions that require some grounding, I think that gets pretty. But I totally understand. Does that help? I hope so. Yeah.
And how many years? You said umpteen years, but how long has this been? How long has it taken to get to this point?
Well, we began in well, it's a hard thing to know when we started, I suppose. Before COVID, like stuff.
Yeah.
So 2022, I think is when we really started to ramp up. And with that, so it hasn't been that long. I think it really helped though that we were already established, you know, we've been working in space for a fair while, so we can walk into these areas and you kind of know about you've done something in that area, so that probably helps a little bit as well. We have an extraordinary team, like we really do, we have an extraordinary team, so that has also been really, and we're a little bit institutionally blind, which what I mean by is I really don't care if you come from UQ or CBU or anywhere, as long as you've got that skill set, we can bring you in and, you know, so we've got people from various different places working in that space.
I'm curious, this might be in the awkward question portion, so you don't have to answer particularly if we're recording. Great talk, first of all, thank you very much, Cathy, for delivering these questions in front of us. Do you find that your institution and the university institutions are helpful? And not just our institutions, but also Aboriginal corporations, and sometimes the structure between the Aboriginal corporation and the communities and the relationships between them. How much of your time is just navigating these larger sort of institutions and how they interact with each other? UQ likes big institutions. They like steady relationships over long periods of time with an Aboriginal corporation. But that sometimes those corporations aren't necessarily well integrated with the community.
Yes.
So how do you do? Is it there's got to be a range of different sort of communities that you're going into, from tenure where everything is sort of well integrated, to other places where there's no tenure, there's not maybe an Aboriginal corporation that's just starting up,
Are you asking a question about how to scale? Is that
I'm asking a question of like how those institutions either help or stop you from doing the things that you're trying to do.
Well, I don't know, if I asked everyone for their data here, I reckon I'd get a pretty gnarly conversation. So I don't know if it's just Indigenous, like there's data is gold. Like if you ever ask a postdoc, what can I have some of your data, that gets pretty interesting pretty quick. So I don't know if it's just an Indigenous question. I think this question around knowledge sharing is always hard, whether you're working with data scientists or whether you're working with Indigenous. So I'd frame it that way. I think also we've got a great, so CSIRO has been absolutely 100% behind this. Because they know that this is kind of a question that is of national importance. So I have to say, CSIRO has been amazing. I think research institutional partners have been 150% behind this in terms of finding ways, like CDU has bent over backwards to make those micro-credentials work and pipeline that. So we literally can do this out in the ground, we pipeline that in, it goes straight into the CDU, up into that stuff takes a bit of work in the background, and I really appreciate that everyone's going, you know what, we're just going to make it work. We have a fantastic funded Telstra Foundation who we've now got into their strategy, which means that we're into a long-term program funding now that is substantial. So that's been awesome. And I think for me, the partnership model, which is about, we provide these forums where you can just come and just dip your toe into a workshop forum, and if you want to engage, we're just very gentle with that process. I'll give you an example actually. So last month we were out in southeast Arnhem, which is a beautiful remote place, and they haven't been ready for about a year. They were really excited, they came to some of the workshops, but they just weren't quite ready. And we've just had the most exciting trip. Like it was just gold. And so now we're going to the board next week and so talking about next year's plan, and so they'll get a little bit deeper. This is, so to me, that's got numbers of institutions around. So I think the approach has to be a little different. People keep saying, but that doesn't scale. And I do go back to this map and go, oh no, that's 10 million hectares. And so I think it's done through a very different scaling mechanism. And I think using digital assets and platforms and videos and those things is our next thing we're thinking through. And now we're just done a deal with Central Land Council and others to start to think about Central. I think that's a different way of approaching it. So do I find Indigenous organisations challenging? Yes. Do I find CSIRO challenging? Yes. Do I know that every single institution like UQ and CSIRO signed up to a reconciliation action plan? We've also signed up to a science and technology in Australia that says Indigenous knowledge is a valid area of knowledge system, but we're not entirely sure where to go with that. Yes. And so if we can put those pieces together, do we have companies that are really keen to make this work? Yes. I mean, I couldn't have done some of this without Microsoft's partnership on our AI for Earth grant. Yes. So I'm really struck by everyone wants to lean in. And I think because we all see it as something that is a bit beyond our own institution, perhaps. Yeah. I don't know if that, not to say one day's husband, there's a lot of negotiation involved. For sure, but I still think everyone honestly is leaning in because they really want this to.
Thanks, Cathy. Amazing talk. Just in terms of these principles, I'm curious about how long is spent on the self-determination and the figuring out what they want and how they want to do things and the important questions and that deep listening and two-way learning. And then also, I know you talked before about the two sort of representatives, how equity plays into that, like how who's around the table deciding what matters and how does social equity play into that?
So when we get the board, I'll give you an example, it's really 10%. When I go to the board, part of it is just negotiating who's got roles in this space. And so elders have to verify digital badges, right? So they have a role. So this is not just, the young people will want to play with the digital tech, so they're very much involved. And so they choose a few young ladies who want to be involved. We just send that out to the community, so as many as you want to play for it. So our last trip had about 20 women involved in that process. It came from actually different groups because some were doing peer learning, so they came across from West Arnhem into Kakadu to teach them how to do that, which we resourced so that we can have some shared decision making there. We have so it's often particularly in Indigenous Australia, men are the patrilineal society, so often the men are the senior elder. So they absolutely play a role in that process of making sure. In some cases, we'll take men with us to be welcome us to country and do those protocols in that process of the available, and often they'll say, can we bring a few young fellows involved? And we say, absolutely. But we just have a negotiation space. So it's very fluid and ongoing. So from the even the digital boss lady sometimes will bring in some people who just watch what's going on. So the next one, I think, whether they're young ones who just want to see and they're not quite ready for the governance story yet, like that, you know, it's got its own special bits and pieces. So they'll bring in young people just to watch and learn, and if they want to take that job up, they can. Our digital boss lady governance has a cultural charter. It has a governance charter which steps out the rules of what we're going to do, how we're going to make decisions. It is quite detailed. And we go back through that cultural charter of how we're going to act and interact, but also how we're going to make decisions on what. And that is shared with every single board in every single group. And we then have a consent process for that to be signed off. So some of it's quite administrative. I think I feel like being a, I don't know, centre or something. But it's really nice to have, because part of the other puzzle is, which I'm sure most of you have, is, you know, the turnover of staff. Like you feel like you've got a partnership sorted, yay, and then the coordinator changes or the, you know, something changes, and so it's quite nice to be able to just have that kind of governance around that, so that we can say, oh, you know, well, this is what we're up to, yeah. So help, yeah. These are different questions than I expected. I'm not sure. Do I get to direct? Sorry, go for it.
I have a question about the stories that are being told. So I do science without an application mind. So I speak to other scientists.
Nice.
And my story, I guess, is shaped up in a way that I speak to other scientists. Who are the stories aimed at that indigenous people bring to the table? Like, is it at scientists, is it at government, or is it at the community, or at what level are they aiming?
Well, it really varies. Actually, we have different, it's a really nice question actually, because this, for example, this stuff, all this is for rangers. It's written literally in ranges. We're crafting, we're just finishing off some videos at the moment where we work with the language centres, and most of them are language. And so if they choose to, or Creole. So those types of arrangements there are really valued by the community and are very community orientated. This, however, is really, so all these are being co-authored with Indigenous partners. This chunk of this. And so part of it has been, actually, I sit on the National AI Centre, whatever section it was. Now I'm trying to write to them to say, actually, AI chatbots contributing to global conservation injustices, because we show that natural language processing models are just getting data insights from Northern Hemisphere male academics. Now that has some consequences for Indigenous local expertise if we're going to start to say what is conservation and what is that justice. So that's a completely different writing science strategy than it is from a ranger book. But the same in terms of this piece up here, this evaluations and research, was actually done at the same time when NEST was asking itself, are we any good or not? So sorry, the fabulous impact that NEST was doing. So part of it was really great for us at the very get-go to say what was successful research to look like, and let's monitor it by an Indigenous steering committee, where we step away and we get evaluated and write about it. And that's actually absolutely targeted at researchers. We wrote for the First Nations drone policy. And so we resourced some of our women rangers to talk about their experiences around using drones and some of the cultural protocols, which I think, I'm not sure if there's a paper in that, it might be a bit older. I only did a few recent ones that Jen led around responsible drone use. Well, that helped, the drone policy guys start to think about, well, what does drone policy look like from the First Nation point of view? Does that help? So we actually really target it to completely different audiences as part of that. It's kind of fun. Oh, sorry, Brian, apologies.
Can you go back to your principal slide?
Up to.
So when you were going through the principles, the fourth one, impact of design, you brushed over that and said you might come back to it.
Sure.
You wanted a question, so I'll ask you a question. So you suggested that some of your own presuppositions were called into question around goal setting and preferred impact.
Yep.
Can you say a bit about that dissonance, like what you were expecting and then the kinds of things that came out in designing what the preferred outcome might look like? In answer to the first question, you said something like it's actually very diverse and maybe it's also evolving. but can you say something about that?
I can. I'll try and answer that in this audience in mind too. So I've worked a lot with the lovely Mark Hockings for many years, and the whole role of that IUCN Green List Eagle is to evaluate conservation effectiveness and put a global standard around that, which is really lovely, a lovely group of volunteers that we do together. But it basically has some assumptions there about what's going to be the impact of conservation effectiveness, yeah? And so there's all these kind of criteria and measures and, you know, and conservation decision science is kind of premised on some of what is going to be the impact of a action, you know, so that's where that kicks in there. So when we start to think about it in this setting, you can hear there's so many strands going on here about what's going to be success. And where do we fit in versus it's actually none of our business, right? So I always say Indigenous people have enough friends, they don't need any more. We've got to actually be there to be useful. There's a usefulness there. So we really had to work out where does digital kick in and not kick in. So there was a piece there around where do we work versus where we don't work? Where do digital tools come into that space and where they don't? And how do we know if there's an impact in that space? So I'm sorry, this is my first day back from holidays, but so we actually set up, we're monitoring it. And they use this framing of digital confidence as a way of framing that impact framing. It's got three parts to it. One is gender. And so it says your position. It says your position in country. It says that you are an elder or you're a manager or you're a young woman or you're a whoever. And so it does take that, if I say positionality, does that okay, so positionality basically just, you know, acknowledges the fact that you're sitting in a system and that affects the way that you navigate the world. So that was one part. The second part was the actual digital technology. And so that talks to things like, do we have the infrastructure involved? Can we afford it? Like if we get a drone, do we know how to fly it? Are there regulations in place? And so they're asking all these really practical questions around if we have to cross over these thresholds. Is it a safe space or we're going to have a little side space there and actually be able to access that space? When we finish out on our trips on country, we've got to make sure that no one else is jealous or everyone else sees the value of that impact, right? And then the third part of it is country. And so this is about, maybe we're really strong on the digital now, but we're a bit unsure about the knowledge of the country. We haven't been here for a long time. This country stuff starts to see stuff. We can go to different places now. We can go and set up an acoustic recorder to go and listen to white-throated grasslands. Okay, we haven't been to that. So what are the protocols there about success that gives us confidence to use digital? So that three-part process was how we've designed the impact of design, and starting to track them both from an individual point of view of how they're navigating that confidence, but also recognising that they're working in a system as part of that process. So it's actually affected by nudges around all that that affects that journey. So we really care about what that individual is doing, but we also know that they're never working alone. They've got elders and they've got access to country, or they've got access to tech, or they've got digital infrastructure, or Skylink doesn't work for a month, or also we're waiting for, if the rains come early this year, that's going to really blast some of our monitoring programs. So all these things matter. And so that's been built in to the way in which we're measuring success. I wasn't going to show the program much of it because it's a bit horrendous, but and I guess the second part of that was, and I think it kind of raises to your question of, is it just for us? And so there was a really, really lovely question that was raised here going, so we have to share this. And so this is why I feel like I can kind of step out here, because this is certainly not my own work, but we have to share this. And so the ladies have been really keen on going, yep, let's go and help the feds work on their First Nation drone policy, or let's have some conversations around the National AI Centre, or let's go talk to Google or Microsoft. They're really keen to share some of their lessons, not only to each other and other rangers, but actually the infrastructures and institutions that can possibly shift the dollar.
Thanks, Cathy. We might probably run out of time now, I think, because we need to get out of the room by, or maybe one more question. Was there one more?
Thank you.
I have. Nobody else does.
I thought there was one. Did you? No, there wasn't. Okay. Sure. One last quick one.
You said you weren't getting the questions you anticipated from us, so I'm wondering what those might be.
The last time I gave a presentation, we were showing some of the ways in which we'd mapped Indigenous lands with conservation values, right? And then some of that work was starting to ask some really big questions around fair versus fair data, both as a scientist and as a practitioner. And what I mean by that is, you can only work in the centre because you can access a bucket load of data that's been collected or shared or the mechanism. The nature of care market, this premise is that you've got to give all that data back to a bucket so that the world can use it. And so that's the kind of top down, that's how we're starting to understand the planet. This is such a valuable proposition that's going on that's extraordinary. I guess is a kind of interesting thing where we're working is, that's great. We're working on that kind of community-based monitoring that's data fueled or AI fueled, or working all that data harder for communities. That's tense. I'm not saying it's easy, it's tense. So how do I navigate this piece here, which is, sorry, just to go through here, that we've had to send this up through to BirdNet, which is a Northern Hemisphere, bird, identifier, and then chunk check, so that's outside the system, that's outside the AI system. We have to talk that through with people to say, some of your data is going to have to be trained by someone else, something else, other birds that don't belong to your country. And so there was definitely a mechanism here of going, okay, no, we've got to do these, 5 different things now to make sure that that's under the care protocols. So I think that, to me, I'm really curious about, this must be really hard for you guys. I mean, I get why people don't do this work actually, because this is different work, and the papers I'm writing are not the papers perhaps that most of this group would write. But I still think it's pretty exciting to have a bit of both. So I'm not saying disrupt all the models and fabulous global analysis you're doing. I think it's just interesting at the same time there is this kind of bottom-up process that we can at least pay attention to, because I think it brings some interesting pieces into the puzzle that we're going to be facing this decade or so.
Great. Thanks so much, Cathy.
Thank you.